You close your eyes. The day has been long. The world outside your window has finally fallen silent. You pick up your rosary, letting the familiar beads slip through your fingers, and whisper, "Hail Mary, full of grace." Somewhere between the third Hail Mary and the deepest intention of your heart, sleep begins to creep in. Your words slow down, your breathing softens, and before you realize it, you've drifted away. Hours later you wake. The candle has burned low. The rosary is still in your hand, tangled between your fingers like a forgotten promise. And immediately that quiet wave of guilt washes over your soul. "I failed again," you whisper to yourself. "God must be disappointed in me." It's a familiar thought, isn't it? That small voice inside that turns even the gentlest weakness into proof that you're not good enough. You tried to pray. You wanted to stay awake. But you didn't. And now you wonder if heaven has turned its face away from you. But what if everything you've believed about falling asleep during prayer is wrong? What if the guilt that presses on your heart is built on a misunderstanding? A misunderstanding that has tormented sincere souls for centuries. What if the moment you drifted into sleep was not a failure at all, but a quiet kind of surrender? Because here's a truth most of us forget. The saints weren't perfect prayers. They were human. They grew weary, they got distracted, they fell asleep too. And none understood that paradox, the tension between spiritual longing and human weakness, better than Saint Teresa of Jesus, the great reformer of Carmel, doctor of the church and master of the interior life. She saw this struggle play out in every convent she founded. Night after night she would hear the same tearful confession from her sisters. "Mother Teresa, I fell asleep again during prayer." Some said it with shame, others with fear, as though they had offended the very God they sought to love. And do you know what she did? She didn't scold them. She didn't tell them to pray harder or stay awake longer. Instead, she smiled that knowing, tender smile that still echoes through the centuries. Because she knew something about the heart of God that many of us have forgotten. God does not measure prayer by the number of words we say. He measures it by the love that made us begin. So many of us approach prayer as if it were a test we could fail. We think God is keeping score, tallying our distractions, our yawns, our moments of fatigue. But Saint Teresa saw prayer differently. She saw it as an act of love, an encounter between the divine and the fragile human heart. And love, she would say, is never wasted. Even when it falls asleep. Think about that. When you kneel in your room, exhausted from the noise of the world, your heart still wanting to whisper something to God before the day ends. Do you really think He's disappointed that your body gave out before your soul was finished speaking? Or could it be that, like a parent watching a child fall asleep mid-conversation, He simply smiles and draws nearer, delighted that you came to Him at all? Saint Teresa herself knew this weariness. She wasn't a woman of endless energy. She was a woman of constant offering. Illness, reforming monasteries, guiding souls, endless correspondence. All of it pressed upon her fragile health. And yet she prayed. Not perfectly, not always consciously, but faithfully. Because she understood something profound. God looks not at the length of our prayer, but at the direction of our heart. In The Way of Perfection she wrote, "It matters more to have the determination to persevere than to have feelings. Determination, not success. Desire, not performance. Love, not flawless attention." This is the heartbeat of Teresa's teaching, the secret that turns guilt into grace. And maybe if you've ever woken with the rosary still wrapped in your hand, you've unknowingly touched that same mystery. The mystery of a God who treasures not the eloquence of your words, but the tenderness of your intention. A God who receives even your sleep as prayer when it's born of love. So the next time you find yourself drifting off in the middle of prayer, don't rush to shame. Pause instead. Ask yourself, what was the last movement of my heart before sleep came? Was it love? Was it longing? Was it trust? Because if it was, then Saint Teresa would say you have not failed. You have simply done what every true lover of God eventually learns to do. To rest in His presence. And that rest may be the most honest prayer of all. But how can that be? How can something that feels like failure become a form of prayer? And where is the line between genuine human frailty and the kind of spiritual laziness that dulls the soul? That's exactly what Saint Teresa of Jesus will teach us next. In her wisdom, she drew a line so clear, so liberating, that it still speaks to every weary soul today. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover might change the way you see prayer forever. So, what did Saint Teresa of Jesus really teach about falling asleep in prayer? Was it carelessness? A sin to confess? a failure to love God enough. Not at all. In fact, Teresa saw it as an opportunity to understand the very heart of divine love. She knew that behind this small, common struggle, this simple moment of human fatigue, lay a question far deeper than sleep. What does God actually desire from us when we pray? For many souls, prayer becomes a performance. We imagine that God is watching, grading our attention span, measuring how long we can kneel, how many devotions we complete, how eloquently we speak. And when we fail to meet these invisible standards, we withdraw in quiet shame. But Saint Teresa shattered that illusion. She taught that God is not a taskmaster keeping score. He is a Father who treasures every attempt of love, no matter how imperfect. In The Way of Perfection she wrote, "It matters more to have the determination to persevere than to have feelings." Those words might seem simple, but they carry the weight of mystical wisdom. Teresa understood that the truest measure of prayer is not how long you stay awake, but how sincerely you keep returning to God even in weakness. Let that sink in for a moment. The mere act of beginning to pray, of turning your heart toward Him, is already a victory of grace. Even if you fall asleep halfway through, even if you repeat the same prayer 1,000 times without emotion, even if your words trail off into silence. Because what moves God's heart is not perfection, it's perseverance. Teresa saw this truth lived out daily in her convents. She often noticed her sisters battling the same discouragement we know so well. One would come to her after night prayer, eyes red from tears, saying, "Mother, I wanted to pray but I couldn't. My mind wandered. My body was so tired." And Teresa, instead of rebuking her, would gently lift her chin and say, "Daughter, do you think God loves you less because you fell asleep trying to speak to Him? No, He loves you more for trying." She distinguished between two kinds of sleep, the sleep of nature and the sleep of negligence. The first, she said, is innocent, the body simply reaching its limit, the soul's exhaustion after a day spent in love and service. The second, however, is spiritual laziness, the drowsiness that appears whenever the heart resists deeper intimacy with God. Discern this difference carefully, she would tell her nuns. The body's weakness draws God's compassion, but the soul's indifference needs awakening. It's such a fine line, isn't it? Because only you and God know the truth behind your tiredness. Are you falling asleep because you've poured yourself out in service to others? Or because, deep down, you've grown comfortable avoiding the silence where He speaks? Teresa's genius was her balance, neither condemning human frailty nor excusing spiritual inertia. She knew that holiness doesn't mean praying perfectly. It means loving faithfully even when prayer feels dry, distracted, or half-conscious. In her writings, Teresa often used the image of a traveler. The soul, she said, is like a pilgrim on a long and rugged road toward God. Some days you walk with strength, other days you stumble, crawl, or fall asleep by the wayside. But as long as you keep turning your face toward Him, as long as your heart still desires the journey, you have not lost your way. And that's the beauty of her teaching. Faithfulness, not flawless execution, is what sanctifies the soul. Teresa once wrote in The Interior Castle, "His Majesty looks more at the love with which we work than at the amount of work we do." That single line is enough to free a lifetime of scrupulous hearts. Because if God looks at love, not productivity, then even your broken, half-finished prayers are precious to Him. Even your sleep, when it comes in the midst of devotion, can become an act of trust. Think of a child talking to their father at bedtime. The father doesn't demand eloquence. He listens to the child's rambling words, the heavy pauses, the eyes that slowly close mid-sentence. And when the child drifts off, the father smiles, covers them with a blanket, and stays near. That, Teresa would say, is how God receives you when you fall asleep in prayer. But she was also a realist. She knew that not every kind of sleep comes from holy exhaustion. Some comes from what she called false tiredness, the sudden drowsiness that always seems to appear when prayer begins but vanishes the moment we turn to entertainment or gossip. Beware of the soul that is only tired when it comes to prayer, she warned. True love finds a way to stay awake. Teresa never meant that we must force ourselves into sleepless heroics. She meant that love, when genuine, seeks wisdom. The wise soul learns to pray at the hour of strength, not the hour of collapse. It arranges its life so that prayer isn't squeezed into the leftover moments, but honored as the first. Still, she knew there would be nights when the body wins, when sleep comes uninvited, when even the saints must surrender to fatigue. And in those moments she offered a simple, beautiful solution: intention. Before beginning prayer, she told her nuns to say quietly, "Lord, if I stay awake, may my wakefulness be for you. If I fall asleep, may my sleep be in your arms." That little act of love transforms everything. It turns prayer from a test into a relationship. Tells God, "I want you more than my own success." And he always responds to that desire. For Teresa, this understanding wasn't a comforting metaphor. It was born of lived experience. She herself suffered from long illnesses that left her barely able to remain conscious during prayer. Many nights she would begin her meditation with fire and end it in slumber. At first she felt shame, thinking she had failed the God she loved. But over time she realized something profound. Even in those hours of sleep, her soul was still resting in him. "I was more present to God sleeping in prayer than awake in the world," she once wrote. It's a paradox only the mystics truly grasp. That the soul's love can outlast consciousness. That prayer isn't merely words, it's orientation. And when your last conscious thought before sleep is of God, that thought continues like a gentle flame through the night. So if you've ever felt unworthy because fatigue interrupted your prayer, remember this. Saint Teresa would see that very moment as proof of your sincerity. Because the person who falls asleep praying has at least chosen the better place to rest. Not in distraction but in God's presence. Still, she would challenge you to look deeper. To ask, as she asked her own nuns, "Do I fall asleep out of love, or out of avoidance? Out of service, or out of habit?" Because love, even when weak, keeps returning. It mourns its failures but never stops showing up. And that, Teresa believed, is what transforms an ordinary soul into a saint. In the next part we'll step even further into her wisdom. To the ancient roots of this understanding in the teachings of the Desert Fathers and early mystics. They too spoke of the soul that sleeps in God, and the mysterious grace that can flow even through human weariness. What they discovered will deepen your peace, and change the way you think about every failed prayer you've ever prayed. Centuries before Saint Teresa walked the quiet corridors of her Carmelite convents, other seekers of God wrestled with the same tender struggle. The battle between prayer and fatigue, spirit and flesh, longing and limitation. In the desert of Egypt, where the early monks withdrew to seek God in silence, stories were told of holy men who would fall asleep during vigils, their candles burning low beside them. One such elder, Abba Poyen, once said, "The monk who falls asleep during prayer, if his heart was truly seeking God, sleeps in the arms of the divine." Teresa would have smiled at those words. She would have recognized in them the same wisdom that she herself discovered centuries later, that God receives the offering of the heart even when the body gives out. The Desert Fathers knew something that modern souls often forget. That prayer is not a performance but a relationship. It's not measured by how long we stay awake but by how sincerely we turn toward love. They called prayer the breath of the soul. And just as a person continues to breathe even while sleeping, the soul that loves God continues to pray, even in slumber. St. John Cassian, whose writings deeply influenced Teresa's own formation, spoke of two kinds of sleep. There is the sleep of negligence, the lethargy that grows from indifference, from a heart cooled by distraction and comfort. And then there is the sleep of nature, the exhaustion that follows honest effort, service and love. He wrote that this second kind of sleep can actually be a form of trust, a childlike abandonment into the Father's care. It's a beautiful thought, isn't it? That when your eyes close in the midst of prayer, you might not be turning away from God at all. You might be falling into Him. For Teresa, this wasn't poetic sentiment. It was reality. During her years of founding monasteries across Spain, traveling rough roads, enduring sickness, caring for her sisters, she knew the exhaustion that blurs body and soul. There were nights when she could barely kneel, when prayer was no more than a sigh, when her heart wanted heaven but her eyelids refused to cooperate. And in those fragile moments she began to understand something that would change the way she taught prayer forever. She realized that prayer is not measured by consciousness but by orientation. That the soul, once turned toward God, can rest in Him even when words fade and awareness slips away. This idea might sound strange to our modern, performance-driven minds. We like progress we can measure, effort we can prove. But Teresa and the early mystics knew a different kind of progress, the quiet growth of trust. They understood that sometimes the most powerful prayer is not spoken but surrendered. Imagine a candle in a chapel late at night. Its flame flickers lower, dimmer, but it still burns. That is the soul at prayer and fatigue. The light may waver, but the fire remains real. Saint Teresa wrote of this when she described what she called the prayer of quiet. A kind of prayer where the soul becomes so united with God that even the senses fall still. It is a rest deeper than sleep, a peace that silences the noise of the world. In this stillness, she said, the soul sleeps but the heart keeps vigil. Have you ever felt that kind of rest? The kind that doesn't come from escaping your responsibilities but from surrendering them? The kind that feels like being held rather than abandoned? That's the prayer Teresa discovered. The prayer that allows the weary to rest without shame. The mystics spoke often of this holy rest. Saint John of the Cross, Teresa's dear friend and fellow reformer, called it sleeping to the world and waking to God. To him, true prayer wasn't always filled with activity or words. Sometimes it was pure stillness, the soul resting in divine love even when the mind sleeps. It's a paradox, but one that reveals something essential about the spiritual life. Grace does not depend on our strength. If it did, the saints would have despaired long ago. The same God who created night for the body's renewal created spiritual rest for the soul. When your heart is weary from loving, when you've poured yourself out for others and still choose to whisper a prayer before sleep, that act, Teresa would say, carries immense power. Because in that moment you're saying to God, I have nothing left but my desire for you. Take even this. And he does. He takes it, receives it, sanctifies it. There's an old story from the early monasteries that captures this perfectly. A young monk once came to his abbot, ashamed. Father, he said, I fall asleep every night during the Psalms. I am not worthy of this life. The abbot placed a hand on his shoulder and replied, My son, when you fall asleep in prayer, the angels finish your psalms for you. Teresa would have loved that story. Not because she believed in sentimental comforts, but because she believed in the generosity of God. The same God who multiplies loaves and fish can multiply your intention when your strength runs out. She knew, as the mystics did, that love is never lost. Every act of love, even unfinished, continues in the heart of God. Every whispered prayer, every drowsy amen, every half-formed thought offered with sincerity, it all becomes part of the eternal conversation between heaven and earth. And yet Teresa also knew that love desires to grow. It doesn't use weakness as an excuse, but as a reason to seek wisdom. To rest when necessary, yes, but also to rise again renewed and keep walking toward the beloved. The Desert Fathers called this rhythm praxis, the dance between work and rest, effort and surrender. They knew that both have their place in the spiritual journey. Too much effort without rest breeds pride. Too much rest without effort breeds sloth. But when effort flows into surrender and surrender returns to effort, the soul learns harmony. That's what Teresa wanted for her nuns, and for you. Not endless striving. Not careless drifting. But a rhythm of love that allows both wakefulness and rest to serve God's purpose. So the next time you find yourself drifting toward sleep with the rosary still in your hand, remember this ancient lineage of wisdom that stretches from the deserts of Egypt to the convents of Spain. You are not alone. You are part of a story that began long before you. A story of frail bodies and faithful hearts. Of souls who learned that even sleep can become a prayer when love leads the way. In the next part we'll bring Teresa's teaching into our own century, to explore how her timeless wisdom can reshape your daily life, your rhythms, and even the way you think about prayer itself. Because holiness isn't about perfection. It's about learning, as she did, to rest and rise again in love. Saint Teresa was never content to leave her teachings floating among the clouds of mystical theory. For her, spirituality was always lived, embodied, practical. She spoke to real people. Sisters who woke before dawn, worked through fatigue, cared for the sick, and still tried to pray with weary hearts. She knew that holiness isn't found in escaping human weakness, but in learning how to bring God into it. That's why her advice for those who struggle with falling asleep during prayer remains astonishingly relevant today. Because in the end, she wasn't teaching about sleep. She was teaching about love. How to love wisely, honestly, and without self-deception. He called this wisdom intelligent love. It means arranging your life, your prayer, and even your rest in harmony with grace rather than against it. Love that is wise, she wrote, prepares the way for prayer instead of stumbling into it unprepared. How many of us, if we're honest, do exactly the opposite? We wait until we're completely drained, Our phones finally silenced, our minds cluttered, our bodies heavy, and then we decide to pray. We kneel half asleep, whispering a few words, and then wake an hour later with guilt in our chest. Teresa understood that pattern well. She saw it in herself and she saw it in others. Her counsel was gentle but firm. Don't fight the sleep itself. Examine what led to it. If you're always praying at the very end of your energy, she said, you're not giving God your best. You're giving him your leftovers. Not because you don't love him, but because you haven't yet learned to love wisely. The soul that loves wisely seeks the times when it can be most fully present to the beloved. For some, that might be dawn before the noise of the day begins. For others, it might be a quiet midday pause, or a simple moment before evening shadows fall. What matters is not the hour but the attention of the heart. Teresa taught her nuns to sanctify these small moments by beginning each prayer with an act of intention. Before she prayed, she would whisper something simple, words anyone can make their own. Lord, I offer you this time. If I remain awake, receive my conscious love. If I fall asleep, receive my trusting rest in your presence. That single act, she believed, transformed everything. It turned the fear of failure into an offering of faith. Told God, even my limits belong to you. Such a small gesture. But the saints understood that heaven moves through small gestures. The soul that prays this way no longer fears fatigue because even its weakness becomes a gift. But Teresa didn't stop there. She also offered a deeper insight, one that challenges modern believers as much as it comforted her sisters. She said that we must learn to cultivate interior wakefulness even when the body is tired. What does that mean? It means training the heart to remain aware of God throughout the day, so that prayer is not a task we perform but a relationship we live. The person who learns to walk with God in small things, washing dishes, speaking kindly, listening attentively, will find that formal prayer flows naturally from that awareness. And when such a person falls asleep at night with the rosary in hand, they haven't ended prayer. They've simply continued it in another form. For Teresa, this was not a metaphor. It was her lived reality. She used to tell her nuns, let your whole life be prayer. Then whether you wake or sleep, you are in his presence. This kind of interior wakefulness doesn't happen overnight. It grows through discipline, gentle, loving discipline. The discipline to pause in the middle of your day and whisper, you are here, Lord. The discipline to notice beauty, to forgive quickly, to love without calculation. Each of these small awakenings keeps your soul alive and alert, even when the body is tired. Teresa also gave her sisters a test, a way to discern whether their tiredness was holy or deceptive. It's a question that still pierces the heart today. What pattern do you see in your prayer life? If you fall asleep only during prayer, but stay alert for hours of entertainment, Teresa would gently invite you to examine what your soul truly desires. She wasn't condemning you, she was offering freedom. Because once you see your patterns clearly, you can begin to love more consciously. She wrote, true love mourns its sleep and seeks to awaken. False love excuses itself and grows comfortable in drowsiness. Her words are direct but never cruel. For her, conviction was simply the doorway to transformation. God doesn't shame us for our weakness, he calls us through it into wisdom. And here's the beauty of that wisdom, it never stays abstract. Teresa turned it into practice. She told her nuns to rearrange their day if necessary, to rest when they needed rest, but to honor prayer with intentional space. To prepare their environment, dim the lights, breathe, silence the mind. And when sleep still came, she told them not to scold themselves, but to finish the prayer later with a smile. Because faithfulness is not measured in unbroken hours, but in the willingness to begin again. Her approach was balanced, almost revolutionary for its time. No harsh asceticism, no unrealistic demands. Just love infused with intelligence. And the fruits, she said, will always reveal the truth. If your prayer, even interrupted by sleep, leads to greater patience, tenderness, and compassion, then grace was at work. But if it leaves you dull, defensive, or complacent, then perhaps it's time to reawaken your heart. The saints never judged prayer by how it looked. They judged it by what it produced. Does it make you love more? Does it make you forgive faster? Does it make you gentler with yourself and others? If yes, then it was real prayer, no matter how imperfect. That's why Teresa could say with utter confidence, the soul that truly desires God will find him even in sleep. There's a quiet liberation in those words, because they mean you no longer have to fear your humanity. You can bring your fatigue, your distractions, your ordinary rhythms, all of it, into the sacred. And God will meet you there. In the end, that's what Teresa's practical wisdom really offers. A way to live where nothing is wasted. Where every sigh, every pause, every drowsy amen can be transformed into love. So tonight, when you kneel to pray and your eyes begin to close, remember this. You are not failing, you are returning. You are not disappointing God, you are resting in Him. And when you wake, if you simply whisper again, I love you, Lord, the prayer continues right where it left off. In the next part, we'll bring this wisdom to its final light. To the mystery of resting in God's love, where weakness itself becomes strength. And where every imperfect act of faith becomes a doorway into grace. There comes a moment in every soul's journey when we finally understand what Saint Teresa discovered through years of struggle, sickness, and prayer. It's the moment we realize that God's love for us has never been about performance. It has always been about presence. We spend so much of our lives trying to be perfect for Him. Perfectly focused, perfectly devout, perfectly faithful. And then one night we fall asleep with a rosary still clutched in our hand and we feel the sting of failure. But what if that very moment, the one we call failure, is actually the doorway through which grace enters? Teresa came to see that God does not measure the soul by its stamina, but by its sincerity. When the body grows weak but the heart still turns toward Him, that movement is everything. It is prayer in its purest form. Because prayer at its deepest is not talking to God, it's belonging to Him. In one of her letters she wrote, "Sometimes the greatest act of love is simply remaining in the place of prayer, even when prayer seems impossible. Remaining. Not succeeding. Not finishing. Just remaining." That one word captures the entire spiritual life. Faithfulness over perfection. Love over performance. Presence over productivity. When Teresa's body failed her, when illness and exhaustion made even kneeling difficult, she learned to offer her weakness as prayer. She didn't hide it, she consecrated it. She would whisper, "Lord, here I am, too tired to speak, too small to stay awake, but still yours." And somehow that tiny act of surrender drew heaven close. Because God is not waiting for perfect words. He is waiting for an honest heart. The saints knew this secret. That divine love meets us most powerfully not at the height of our strength, but in the cracks of our weakness. When you no longer have the energy to impress God, you finally give Him the chance to embrace you. That's why falling asleep in prayer when done from love isn't a failure. It's faith in its most childlike form. It's the soul saying, "Father, I trust you enough to rest." And that, Teresa would say, is spiritual maturity, not endless striving but peaceful trust. Not the frantic effort to hold on, but the quiet confidence that you are already held. She warned her nuns never to mistake exhaustion for indifference, but also never to fear weakness. For weakness, she said, is the raw material of grace. It's what allows God to prove that His strength is made perfect in us. So if you find yourself in that place tonight, too tired to pray, too distracted to focus, but still reaching out to God, know that you are exactly where Teresa began her greatest prayers. On the edge of surrender. In the gentle space where effort fades and trust begins. Close your eyes, then. Let the weight of your body rest, but let your heart stay awake in love. Whisper once more, even half-consciously, "Jesus, I am yours." And let that be enough. Because in God's eyes, it always is. Maybe when you wake, you'll find your rosary still in your hand. Maybe you'll smile instead of feeling guilty. Maybe you'll realize that what you thought was failure was actually communion. The quiet kind that doesn't need words. Saint Teresa's life was full of those moments. Moments when heaven seemed silent, prayer felt impossible, and yet love remained. And each time she chose to begin again, to rise, to whisper, to trust, her soul grew stronger. That is what she leaves us. A legacy of perseverance made gentle by love. Her message, across the centuries, is the same one you need to hear tonight. You are not loved because you pray perfectly. You are loved because you keep returning. So let this be your new understanding of prayer. Every attempt is precious. Every beginning is sacred. Every breath that turns toward God, even if followed by sleep, rises to Him as worship. When you pray with love, you cannot fail. And if you've found peace in this reflection, if Saint Teresa's wisdom has reminded you that grace lives even in your weakness, I invite you to stay with this journey. Because her voice still has more to teach, more to heal, more to reveal about the mysterious beauty of the soul's friendship with God. Subscribe to Timeless Wisdom of Saint Teresa, and let these moments of reflection become part of your own rhythm of prayer. A quiet space where your soul can rest, and your heart can learn again and again, that even in your smallest acts of love, you're already home in Him.